placement was about developing indicators of success for nature-based interventions. It was hosted by Natural England. So I'm Geoff Whitman, and I'm based here at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'm within something called the Health Protection Research Unit. What these are not is these are not sort of medically prescribed, so these tend to be community based, and so they revolve around things like gardening, like working in city farms, working with animals. It could be just sort of walking out in nature. So they tend to be quite low level sort of interventions with people who in theory don't come with really complex kind of, say, mental health issues, and it's a way of sort of facilitating sort of well-being. It helps people feel better, it helps them feel connected, it helps them get out of maybe they've been housebound, or they're struggling to come out into the community, and it sort of facilitates kind of community interactions.
So here at the Bromley by Bow Centre we run classes, health and wellbeing gardening classes for people with mental, physical and learning needs. We also get people from social prescribing, from the GPs who may be suffering from depression, and they come and do a bit of gardening because I think being outdoors makes you feel better. Myself, I suffered from a bit of anxiety and depression, so I've changed roles. I've worked at this centre for 24 years and I've now come into the gardens, and my well-being is so much better now because I think nature is great for people that are feeling a bit isolated.
There is a need to show that these sorts of interventions, will create value for money, that they, are actually that they're worth diverting funds from an already overstretched NHS system into. And you can't just do that on hearsay. You have to be able to produce something that shows that they will produce some kind of indicator. It might be that it's a reduced GP visit, it might be that it's a reduced amount of hours that people spend in hospital wards, but there tends to be a need to produce a sort of financial reasoning behind why you would justify sending resources into these things. And one of the things with the nature-based interventions is a difficulty of doing just that. So there's of producing kind of a sort of financial measures of success. So the first ones were to basically work out in Tower Hamlets who were the organisations that were involved in this, really, who were the key players. So that was sort of mapping the network, and that was from volunteer and community-based organisations all the way up to the sort of clinical commissioning public health people in Tower Hamlets. There was a second objective about trying to work out where the barriers were. So, what were the barriers within that network that sort of prevented, the net maybe working together, or was, the sort of facilitating the flow of information, or, getting people to work together was a second one. I was also interested in looking at the idea of how evidence is used in that network. So is it used differently? So when we talk about sort of justifications, you're talking about essentially creating sort of targets, So does it mean one thing for sort of public health and clinical missioning people to talk about evidence and their need for evidence versus what, say, a community organisation might see as evidence? Those two things might be very different in that network. So it was kind of seeing if there were differences in that, and whether there was a sense in which those sorts of different ideas about evidence might be able to sort of work together, or whether that in itself actually acts as a barrier because they think quite differently. So that was one of them, and then it was about how we might better use evidence, to sort of help promote these schemes and facilitate financial investment in them. And the sort of a big overarching sort of objective at the end is to sort of basically use this as part of a much broader kind of suite of evidence to see if you can use these sorts of placements, these sorts of projects that I've been involved in, to feed up to sort of National Health England and Public Health England as evidence in itself that would justify them actually drawing down their sort of limited resources into these sorts of schemes in a community, sort of community-based schemes, basically. There's been a lot of approaches. So it's involved a mixture of things. There was a kind of literature review thing at the beginning in terms of not strictly sort of writing literature, but getting involved with the literature. Natural England were great at sending lots of reports through, and policy reports and stuff that have come through about the sort of area of social prescription, nature-based intervention. So it's getting familiar with an area that I wasn't familiar with. I had meetings with Natural England quite a lot to sort of set out what the placement would look like and how we would go about it. And then it was a question of making the contacts in Tower Hamlets. And so I spoke to organisations, I conducted interviews with people in key organisations throughout the network. And then the sort of last thing of it will be to sort of bring this together in a sort of, like a sort of meeting that will hopefully bring people from the National Health and Public Health England together to sort of to discuss these results in a kind of more of a group kind of setting towards the end of the placement. There's a very active kind of grouping of organisations who are all very involved in kind of nature-based stuff, but they don't necessarily speak to each other, don't necessarily all know what's going on. Would be the first thing. The other thing in terms of barriers around this is that most of this is done at the sort of community and sort of volunteer level, which means that you run into the usual things of resources and short-term placements of people, high turnover of staff. So there is a lack of resources, both financial and people, to actually maintain these schemes, going forward. I think what's also been found is that evidence does mean very different things depending on where you are in the network. So, for example, you can work at a community level, and evidence can mean the people that they work with can say that they feel better. They might smile for the first time in days because they've been out and they've been engaged in one thing, but they actually managed to get out of the house. That's a huge success. That is not really counted as evidence when you move up the scale and you get moved more towards a sort of clinical commissioning or a public health people where evidence is much more, has to be sort of quantified. It's very difficult to quantify that sort of evidence. So matching up these different sorts of evidences, has come out very strongly, which leads on to the problem of how you evaluate these sorts of schemes. So it's very difficult to evaluate schemes when there are, a sort of myriad different ways in which evidence is collected and methodologies used and the sorts of evidence that is collected. So there's a lack of consistency about how you evaluate, but there's also a lack of consistency about the sorts of targets that people are expected to reach. So a lot of people talk about doing these schemes and being asked to evaluate, but not actually being given any targets to evaluate against. I think there's still an expectation that a lot of this stuff would sit within a medical model of how you do things. And I think this placement has thrown up questions about whether that's the most appropriate model to be thinking about these sorts of schemes in a place like that, because I think it's an uncomfortable fit, if it fits at all, that kind of model onto this. I've really enjoyed the placement, and I would recommend, if people think about doing these things going forward, to apply. I wouldn't have been able to do this without the placement scheme. So it's allowed me to go into a new area, to explore, albeit quite briefly, but nonetheless I think some important stuff has come out of this, a new area, this area of nature-based intervention. It's sparked really quite a strong interest in me to try and keep doing some work in this area going forward. I've made new connections both at the community level, in policy organisations. I've had an insight into how a large and complex policy organisation works, and some of the difficulties that they have, as well as an insight into how the workings and the problems that community organisations have, when they're trying to sort of keep this sort of work going forward, but the real problems that they face. It's created an ongoing network here. Obviously, all these things require funding and all the rest of it, but nonetheless, it has done that. It's created a network. So it's and I think it's also introduced a lot of people who hadn't heard of the Valuing Nature programme and what Merck do here to that programme, and it's created some real interest in people finding out more about, okay, so this is a scheme that seems to sort of chime with our own interests in our relationship to the environment and human health. We didn't know about it. Ideally, I'd like to take forward an opportunity to write a bigger project proposal to do a lot more work in this. That's what I'd like to do. I don't feel that this work is anywhere near finished. I think that if I'm in that position to do that, I think having done this placement is a really good, solid background in actually writing a bigger proposal and having the sort of insights to write that proposal based on actually having done this for the last sort of 4 months. So I think it's been invaluable in those ways.